Hi all, welcome to today's webinar, which is all about positive leadership and specifically how to use positive leadership to accelerate recovery from the crisis. So my name is James Brook and I'm the founder and MD of Plexus Leadership. I've been involved with positive leadership and strengths-based leadership now for about 25 years. Before setting up Plexus Leadership, I founded and ran an organization called StrengthScope, which is now one of the world's leading strengths assessment and development companies. The genesis for that business was my personal experiences of seeing how positive leadership and strengths-based practices can really transform a company's performance. When I worked in a leadership position for a large pharmaceutical company in 2002, so it was a very personal experience that set me on this journey of using a more strengths-based positive psychology approach to create or to develop better leaders and positive organizations. And since then, I've been following that passion to bring this more positive approach to leadership, talent management, and organizations through pragmatic consulting and coaching solutions. So just before we start, I want to run through some housekeeping items very quickly. First of all, the webinar is going to be recorded and shared with you after the session. Secondly, please feel free to ask any questions using the Q&A box and not the chat box, please. And I'll also be muting all of you to improve the sound experience for everyone, but I'm going to stop occasionally and at the end to see whether or not there's any questions. And then finally, if you want to find out any more information about positive leadership or to read our blogs, you can always visit our website at www.plexusleadership.com. So let's start and just look at what we're going to be covering in today's webinar. First of all, we're going to be exploring why positive leadership is the right approach for the times we're experiencing, where there's a lot of complex and challenging changes that leaders are needing to deal with. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what sets positive leaders apart from other leaders. We're going to move on to look at how positive leaders build thriving learning cultures. And then finally, we're going to look at some practical ways to grow positive leadership in your organization, just to kind of get you started. So first of all, I just want to answer the question around what is positive leadership. And there's various definitions to positive leadership, but we define it as a leadership approach that helps teams and organizations achieve breakthrough performance, thriving workplaces, and sustainable growth. It's important, certainly from our perspective, to stress that it's not about making people happy or expecting them to smile and show up at work positive every single day. And I think that certainly that's one of the myths that we see about positive leadership, that it's equivalent to happyology, which in our view is completely incorrect. Positive leadership is also about dealing with the real kind of tough times, the so-called negative emotions as well, and giving those legitimacy. So what I'd like to ask you all to think about is how you've been feeling during the crisis, and also not just how you're feeling, but how your work colleagues are feeling and your family's feeling. Just maybe reflect on that for a while. So for most of us, the whole COVID situation has felt like a roller coaster of emotions, as you can see on the slide. Even for those who are fortunate enough not to have had anyone affected directly by the pandemic, our emotional journey resembles the psychological grieving process, which starts with obviously stage one, the disbelief, and then the anger, the sadness, the acceptance, and finally the optimism. Most people have had one or more anxieties, so that's the reality of the situation, and those have arisen through job insecurities, financial worries, homeschooling of the kids, fear of infection themselves, medical treatment disruptions, lack of contact with relatives, all sorts of, there's a host of things that are causing all these kind of fears and anxieties for people. And the implication of that is that that's brought into sharp focus the importance of leadership qualities like compassion, empathy, kindness, and resilience. It's really changing also beliefs about how leaders should motivate, manage, and get the best out of people in order to ensure a high-performing organization. And leaders can't just focus anymore on tasks and performance. They've really got to focus on the well-being of their people and the psychological health of their people. They need to, as we've said, be building social, emotional, and psychological competencies to deal with these unprecedented levels of change and how those changes are going to be impacting people. So let's just talk a little bit more about some of the other changes, because it's not just COVID. We're going to obviously, we've talked specifically about COVID, and that's the focus for this webinar, but it's not just COVID that's presenting challenges for leaders. There are many other challenges. And I like to see the challenges in these four kind of main categories, these four main areas. First of all, what I call the company purpose challenge. And the company purpose challenge is all about answering the questions: why are we here? What value are we creating for customers? What do we want to be known for? What sort of legacy do we want to leave? What sort of impact do we want to have on the planet? So these are questions relating to, as I say, this area of company purpose. The second area is what I call the talent challenge. And that's really about how do we find, motivate, retain, and develop the best talent possible? How do we get world-class talent into the organization and keep people, motivate them, and get the best out of them? Then the next area is what I call the productivity challenge. And that's really about how we can do more with less by deploying our people and resources in smarter ways. So we can't anymore simply look at productivity gains without, for example, using more collaborative approaches or bringing in smarter technologies. So it's really important that we look outside of the box for some of these productivity gains, because organizations, in the UK and all over the world have been required to do a lot more with less. And then the adaptation challenge. The adaptation challenge is one of the key challenges and very relevant in the context of this webinar today. And that's really about how do you anticipate and respond to changes and disruptive forces, including things like climate change, changing customer preferences, and so on. And how do you ensure that you're taking employees with you on the journey of that change, and they're supportive of the change as opposed to resisting that change? So these are the four challenges that I typically refer to when I'm talking about the challenges that most leaders face today. As we've seen, traditional approaches to leadership and leadership development no longer work as they used to in the past. So companies and leaders are increasingly seeing this, and many are changing, though still probably too few in our opinion. So let's consider some of the main shifts in leadership beliefs and assumptions that leaders and organizations need to understand. First of all, we see a shift from more directive leadership from the top to leadership capability being required at all levels to create an environment where people thrive. So it's distributed leadership, if you want, or democratized leadership. Then secondly, we've got to move from more rigid organizational structures and responsibilities to agile, highly empowered teams. Then we're also seeing a big shift from more narrow, individually oriented problem solving to much more creative, solution-based, collaborative problem solving. We also need to move from more infrequent gap-based performance and development dialogues, which we know don't work particularly well, to much more kind of ongoing strengths-based and development dialogues. So very frequent, on an ongoing basis, at least maybe every couple of weeks meetings with employees, but also making sure that they're very appreciative and they're focused on how can you use your strengths better, differently, to perform even better moving forward, as opposed to being backward looking and also deficit based. Then looking at moving from focusing on developing job-related skills and knowledge only to focusing more on developing positive attitudes, transferable skills, and also, most importantly, probably psychological capabilities. I think everyone needs to feel mentally strong dealing with a crisis like COVID, and there's going to be many more of these sorts of crises. So things like resilience and self-efficacy and grit and these sorts of psychological capabilities are going to be increasingly important, and the spotlight needs to be put on those moving forward by leaders, and leaders need to help employees develop those. Then, of course, we also, innovation is absolutely a critical capability for any organization, not just for-profit businesses moving forward. But we need to move away from this notion that innovation needs to be owned by an R&D function and just based on internal expertise, to much broader system-wide innovation, which is based on collaborative intelligence, customer input, and technological advancement. And we need to look at how technology can enable people to do their jobs better and smarter, and how we can ensure that we maximizing those technology people partnerships. And then finally, organizations are shifting, and we're going to see an increasing rate of shift from just focusing on short-term financial performance measures to financial and ESG measures. And many boards actually now are being required to introduce ESG goals and targets into their performance planning. So by ESG, we obviously mean environmental, social, and governance. So this is about creating greener organizations that are actually looking out for the environment and society, and are much more responsible. So they're not just looking to make a quick profit. They're looking also at longer term implications of the way they do business. And I think the point here that we need to make is that if leaders don't make these mindset and behavior shifts, if they don't move over to the right-hand side, in other words, they're putting their companies increasingly at risk. And I'll give you an example of that. There's quite a few C-suite executives who still don't see the value of taking responsibility for ESG improvement seriously, and they're going to really kind of compromise their company and also their opportunities for investment, because a lot of the big funds now, the pension funds, the venture capital firms and so on, are requiring an ESG, high levels of ESG performance in order to invest in those companies. And that's, of course, if C-suite execs are not taking this seriously, the performance and remuneration is going to suffer, and ultimately they're going to be obsolete and be replaced. It's really important that leaders understand that the world is changing, and that their mindset, their attitudes, and their behaviors need to change to make sure that they're getting the best out of people, and making sure that they're meeting performance targets and creating sustainable businesses. So I just want to introduce you to what we call the thriving workplace pyramid, and this is a pyramid we built, and it's really to understand the conditions that will enable employees to thrive, to be at their best. If we start off at the bottom of the pyramid and we work our way up, first of all, people need conditions where they are feeling physically and psychologically safe, and that means that they should feel that their employer cares about them, will look out for them, will cover for them if things go wrong, but also that the employer won't only look after the physical health, but of course the mental health and well-being of their employees. The concept of psychological safety, we're hearing a lot about it at the moment. It's becoming increasingly popular in organizations in the UK and elsewhere. It's not a brand new concept. It was actually first coined in the 90s. It basically means that if we want to kind of just drill down a little bit, it basically means that people can show up and they can be themselves without being embarrassed, marginalized, intimidated, or punished by their leaders and colleagues. So they feel that they can voice their opinions, they can share their ideas, without any fear of reprisals. We can't really spend a lot more time on psychological safety in this webinar, but I would strongly recommend you check out Professor Amy Edmondson's work. She's at Harvard, and she's written some great stuff on psychological safety. So if you check out her stuff, you can find out more about this really, really important concept and how that applies at work. If we look at the next level is all about belonging, and people, of course, want to feel included. They want to feel that they belong. They don't want to be excluded. They don't want to feel marginalized. They also want a voice in how they do their work. So it's really important to give them that sense of inclusion, of belonging, and allow them to contribute ideas and opinions to shape the future of the company. And this is increasingly important, especially if you look at some of the younger generations now. They expect to be included right from the get-go, and they expect for example, their strengths to be played right from the get-go. The third level is all about achievement and success. Leaders and organizations can meet these needs of achievement and success through delegation, through empowerment, through recognition, so people feel they're contributing in meaningful ways and they're valued for the work that they're doing. And then finally, of course, everyone would like to grow and learn. They want to become the best version of themselves, and leaders can facilitate this through providing learning and stretch opportunities and helping people to adapt. So it's really about helping people to move outside the comfort zone, supporting them, and giving them great development opportunities so they can fulfill their full potential. So if leaders are helping employees, creating the conditions to help employees to meet these needs, these 4 levels of needs, then you're going to have generally a strong, thriving workplace where people are going to put in the extra discretionary effort, people are going to perform at their best, and you're going to get better results than you would otherwise achieve. So let's look at specifically the behaviors of positive leaders and how they can create these thriving workplaces. So firstly, positive leaders inspire people to get behind a purpose, a meaningful purpose that involves a lot more than numbers on a spreadsheet. So it's beyond, just simply saying to people, well, we need to achieve 100 million in the next year. It's thinking way beyond that, and it's actually creating a strong narrative, a compelling narrative for people to get behind. For example, we want to cure a particular disease area if they're a pharmaceutical organization, something like that. So it needs to be very sort of customer oriented as well. So in short, really, they're encouraging people to come on a journey to change the world with them for the better. And this is really important. And all organizations now are recognizing the importance of this and starting to do it. So for example, traditional oil and gas majors like BP and Shell are redefining themselves now and their purpose to ensure that they can keep talent and customers who are expecting them to contribute to a greener, low carbon world. So they're investing in greener technologies and sources of energy, like, for example, offshore wind farms and carbon capture and these sorts of things. Secondly, positive leaders are catalysts for positive relationships within and outside their teams. And what we mean by that is they using skills like listening, like questioning, like empathy and compassion to build deep, caring relationships with co-workers, but also others outside the organization, all sorts of stakeholders, including partners, shareholders, the board, and various other stakeholders to achieve better results and long-term partnerships. Then positive leaders are making sure that they're building highly empowered, thriving teams, because if you do that, then you can drive exceptional execution and delivery. And they they're ensuring that they build those teams, they motivate those teams, they move them from sort of forming the team, right through to performing really well. And they do that, as I say, in a way which is very supportive, which is also very empowering, to get the best out of the team. And finally, if you look at the, as we're moving clockwise, obviously, if you look at the last kind of area, it's all about adaptation, and adaptation requires leaders to build collaborative learning cultures so that teams and organizations can adapt quickly. Leaders who are encouraging adaptation ensure that people are curious, they're allowed to experiment, they can take some risks, and also that their ideas are valued. They feel that they can input their ideas regardless of what those ideas are. And of course, also they do things like organize learning reviews to make sure that, action learning reviews to make sure that after every significant project or program of activity, the team can sit and review how they've done and look at ways of doing things differently. So that in turn, of course, creates high levels of innovation and high levels of improvement in the organization. So in summary, these sorts of behaviors that we've just looked at on the previous slide, that's really creating this virtuous success pathway, because if positive leaders are doing these things and doing these things really effectively, then what's happening is that's amplifying positive emotions, attitudes and emotions, things like positivity, commitment, optimism, hope, self-esteem, well-being. So all the things you've seen on the slide, those positive leadership behaviors are amplifying. And that in turn, of course, generates positive behaviors amongst employees. So ownership and initiative increases, you get greater energy and effort, you get high levels of collaboration and shared learning, you get more positive, caring and supportive relationships, and you get a lot more creative problem solving. And these things, of course, then ultimately lead to better organizational outcomes and impact. So you've got a strong cause and effect relationship in the pathway, and that's been established through decades now of peer-reviewed research. So it's not just a conceptual model, it's an evidence-based model where you get a nice kind of virtuous pathway created here in organizations. And let's look at some of the evidence. So you're probably thinking, well, where is the evidence? And by the way, we're more than happy to send you research articles and so on to elaborate on the slide. But if we just look at some of this evidence, so first of all, in a significant study involving over 1 million employees done by Gallup on the effect of strengths-based development, which is very much related to positive leadership and positive organizations, they found that strengths-based development leads to up to a 15% increase in staff engagement, up to a 19% increase in sales, up to a 7% higher customer engagement scores, and a 29% increase in profits. So you can see this is very significant in terms of kind of hard evidence that this stuff works. And on the right-hand side of the slide, what you can see there is the outcomes of, or the findings of a study of 30 healthcare organizations, which was measuring positive leadership practices over a 2-year period. And the study found that performance improved across a wide variety of performance areas. And you can see some of those areas. So patient satisfaction, climate, participation, quality of care, and so on. So these are very significant percentage increases across a wide variety of dimensions. And of course, that wasn't an insignificant number of organizations. We're talking about 30 healthcare organizations there. And then finally, I just want to talk a little bit about some research by a professor at University of Nebraska, a professor by the name of Fred Luthans. So Fred Luthans and his fellow researchers have found very significant improvements in a range of organizational outcomes when leaders improve what is described as psychological capital. And I'll just define that. So psychological capital uses an acronym, and the acronym is HERO, 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 and that stands for hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And the research showed that when leaders use behaviors and practices that increase psychological capital, so they increase hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and psychological well-being all grow significantly. And there's been a whole range of studies which support those early outcomes by Fred Luthans and his team at University of Nebraska. So those outcomes have been replicated in multiple studies outside of the US, across the world. So there's some very compelling research. So what can you do to actually develop positive leadership? Well, unfortunately, there's no one magic formula for developing positive leaders. However, based on my experience with literally dozens of local, global companies, and also looking at the research findings, I'm going to propose a few steps that you can take. And they categorized into these three areas: discover, develop, and deploy. So let's look at each in turn. First of all, discovery. Discovery is all about discovering more about our strengths, the strengths of the teams, the work in the organization, and of course, the strengths of the organization more broadly. And then also getting clarity on the purpose and getting clarity on what beliefs and attitudes are required for success. And the key part of this is to hire leaders who are human-centered, people encouragers and developers, not just technical experts. I think far too many organizations just look for technical experts, and somebody performs well in a team as a technical expert and they promote it into a leadership role. Secondly, it's important to invite leaders to clarify the purpose of the business with the input from employees. It should be a shared purpose, and it's important to get people on board right from the get-go in defining that purpose. And of course, a strong purpose is going to be anchored in the customer value proposition. We've said that already, but I just want to kind of re-emphasize that because it's so important. And then thirdly, in relation to discovery, it's important to help people to discover their strengths using an accurate, proven strengths assessment tool like StrengthScope or something similar. It's really important to put the focus on the strengths, the successes, the possibilities, to get people to to unlock people's creativity, unlock people's energy, and to unlock people's confidence in moving things forward. So a strengths focus will definitely do that and help people to be more energized to perform in relation to the goals and in relation to the overall purpose of the organization. And that can be done obviously through performance dialogues, it can be done through team builds, it can be done through career development discussions, and so on. If we move on to develop is all about developing positive leadership practices. And of course, what's really important is to kick that off by setting goals for leaders that go beyond financial and operational KPIs, including, as we've said, goals around people, around culture, around innovation, and also around ESG performance, so environmental, social governance performance. So it's important that what gets kind of rewarded, what gets measured, ultimately gets done better. So it's really important to include goals around these areas, and that will generate high levels of financial performance as well. Secondly, in relation to developing these positive leadership practices, it's really important to invest, of course, in developing leaders. And organizations now are using kind of blended learning. So that involves online, face-to-face. Obviously, face-to-face hasn't really been possible at the moment, but of course, we'll have face-to-face back, hopefully, shortly. Blended learning solutions are very powerful, and those would include, not just online, face-to-face, but in terms of the learning formats would include things like action learning, peer coaching, individual coaching, and so on. And the focus of the training should not just be on, changing behaviors and skills. As we've said, it's really important to look at beliefs, mindsets as well, and shifting those beliefs and mindsets in terms of what great leadership looks like. And the great leadership is not about telling people what to do, and great leadership is not about knowing all the answers and so on. So it's really about challenging some of those limiting assumptions and beliefs and replacing them with much more positive and much more enabling ones. And then finally, in relation to deploying positive leadership practices broadly in the business, it's really important to encourage an open feedback culture so people can learn from each other, and learn how to do things in different ways and do things in smarter ways. So organizations that do this well use a variety of techniques. I'm just going to mention a few here. So you can use things like feed forwards, you could use 360 feedback tools, and you could also use brainwriting in addition to brainstorming. Brainwriting is actually probably more effective than brainstorming, and that is about anonymous feedback platforms or forums where people are submitting their ideas, and people are having an opportunity to discuss those ideas without fear of being singled out, or without fear of being named in the process. So everyone puts in their ideas, and those ideas are anonymized, and then everyone talks about the ideas, and the best ideas are selected. So that's what brainwriting is all about. So that can be very powerful here as well. And then finally, it's really important to help leaders to understand what a great learning culture looks like and why it's important. So a great example of this is Microsoft, and Microsoft have really embraced the growth mindset, which is all about people who are curious. They look for opportunities to move beyond the comfort zone, look for new ideas, look for opportunities to improve continuously. Now, Microsoft are using this growth mindset concept by training leaders and training employees on how to be continuous learners, basically how to be very kind of open-minded, very curious, and how to use the best learning techniques. So that's a good example of an organization that's deploying positive practices really effectively inside their organization. And then finally, it's really important, of course, to invest in training development programs to encourage creativity, entrepreneurial thinking, and experimentation, because the best organizations are organizations that are innovating for the future. Organizations like Tesla, organizations like Toyota, organizations like Unilever. And then, of course, we've also got to make sure that it's fun, that it sticks, and spread those positive success stories and use those as an opportunity, as a catalyst, really for continuous improvement and continuous change in the right direction. Right, so that's all. I just want to see if there are any questions before we close off. And I'm actually not going to, I'm going to switch off the recording here. I'm not going to record the questions. Let me just switch off there.